Welcome back to Central American Voices podcast. Today we're joined by Jared Olson, an independent journalist whose work focuses on human rights, violence, and environmental issues across Central America, especially in Honduras. Jared has reported for outlets like The Intercept, Vice, and The Nation, uncovering the complex realities behind militarization, corruption, and grassroots resistance. Thank you, Jared, for being with us today. It's honestly a pleasure to have you here.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I know, so you study journalism, political science, and Spanish, but what was the thing that inspired you to get interested in Central America and especially like focusing in Honduras?
Yeah, so I think it was kind of like part of it was serendipitous, and then I mean, some of it was random, and some of it was serendipitous, and then some of it was just genuine, like like I don't actually know how to make sense of it, but so like when I was late, I grew up in Florida, right, in Central Florida. And I always knew, on one side of my life, I always knew I loved to write, but then I also I hit that pretentious, but I think really important stage of being like 14 to 15, you become really ethically engaged with the world, which I actually think is a beautiful thing if you never lose it. And then so I was like, what can I do to combine those two things, like caring about social justice and justice or whatever? And so I thought journalism. And then, so growing up in Florida, you have more proximity than most states, not as much as like California, I think, or Texas, but you have a lot of proximity to Latin America, and you hear a lot about it. And I knew that I wanted to do let's just say foreign journalism. And I don't know why, it just sounded cool, right? And so I, on my own, learned Spanish late in high school, and around 2014 to 2016, I started learning it that way. And I was a god awful student, and I was all the way through college. I was a terrible student, but I started learning Spanish, and then like that's when I started getting into Latin American history, which I thought was super cool. And I remember reading. It's kind of like cheesy looking back on it now, but I remember reading like John Lee Anderson's biography of Che and thinking like, oh, this is so cool. Even though I look back now and I'm like, oh, Che is kind of a mixed guy or whatever, right? But nonetheless, like getting that like super like because you're never taught about all the incredibly dramatic and beautiful like especially the revolutionary history of the 20th century Latin America, right? And there's lots of beautiful things post Cold War. Like I think that that's a myth that there's no powerful political struggle or anything like that afterwards. But I feel like I don't know what your guys' experience was like, but for me, it was like really exhilarating to discover like this whole revolutionary tradition, and not just like to fetishize guerrillas or whatever, right? But an entire tradition of resistance to the kind of laboratories of capitalism, imperialism that were always created in these spaces. So it was like it was not just about repression, right? It was about these decades long stories of people, from the most difficult situations, and these kind of heroic stories of trying to push back and create a different world. And like when you're like 16 or whatever, I feel like there's this sort of thing which I'm determined to never do. But when you hit like 30 or 40 or whatever, you like make a whole thing of being like, oh, I was so stupid when I was younger, and now I'm a Republican or whatever. And I don't think
Mhm.
that's going to happen anymore. But yeah, that was like at least my parents' generations, and my family is as like white as you could get, right? Um, so I remember thinking that and being like, wow, this is so cool. Anyways, fast forward, I don't want to get lost or whatever. So I like knew I wanted to do that kind of journalism. I was starting to learn Spanish, and I was really bad for years, but I had a lot of fun with it. So then I went to college. Um, and I barely got through in college as well, but like I like to read a lot. And so I mostly read about Latin American history, right? Starting with the 80s, and like the classic texts like,
Mhm.
Empire's Workshop by Greg Grandin, like Roberta Menchú and her biography and stuff like that, autobiography. And then I started basically, so I got a student grant from the Pulitzer Center in 2018 when I was 20 to go to Mexico and see the Zapatista autonomous zones in Chiapas or whatever, which still exist to this day. And I like didn't know anything that I was talking about. Like you look back and you're like, oh shit, I didn't know anything. But like if
Mhm.
you're enthusiastic and passionate, you can figure it out if you're willing to try to do that. So anyways, I went to Chiapas in 2018, pretty close to Central America, but like I'd always read mostly about Central America, and I was really curious about it, right? So I'd kind of gotten the bug of like really liking reporting, and especially like doing field reporting and trying to go like I was interested in like what was up with indigenous peoples and their struggles, and I was interested in kind of from an early stage like displacement and how people pushed back against
Mhm.
that and what were the forces behind that. So basically, to fast forward, I started in college getting student grants, and I went a few times to Guatemala. I went, I think, like two times to Guatemala, where I wrote the first like kind of freelance story I ever did, which I'm still proud of, which was about indigenous community radios run in places like Quetzaltenango, Shela, or whatever, right? Where people, many of them actually ex-members, men and women who were members of the guerrilla in the 80s, who run indigenous language like Mam Maya radio stations, to like talk about all sorts of social issues and just like, have a fucking radio station and a Mayan language, which is super cool. That was super fun. And then after that, so I kind of like, these things progress and I was like more and more getting into it, right? And at this time, and now the spring of 2019, I'd always seen, like Honduras is consistently one of like the sources of the most undocumented migrants coming to the US, right? And, I feel like as a journalist, and, not everyone needs to be like me and actually, whatever, right? But I feel like at least for me, um, you have kind of an ethical responsibility, especially coming from a place of privilege, especially coming from the US, to like, where is the injustices most closely tied to your country, right? And the US screws with shit, in the whole world and most of Latin America, right? But especially in Honduras, the history is extremely tied up, right? And so at that point in April of 2019, I was, already burning out in like my junior year of college and I was looking for another reason to get a grant, get money to go down. And that was when the IMF protests against then President Juan Orlando Hernandez were blowing up. And it was led by doctors, right? Because basically the IMF, US directed institution, says to this country that it's being run by basically a drug trafficker, right? And his coterie of like state sanctioned drug traffickers who are also far right and at the time are close to the now again President Trump. They say, "Oh, well, you want your $9 bajillion of debt reduced, and I can't remember the actual amount of numbers it is, right? But it's insane." And they were like, what they do with every poor country, they're like, "You want that debt slightly reduced? All right, privatize your hospitals." And now I've spent more time in Honduran hospitals, and it's savage how brutal the conditions are to begin with, right? But then, so the idea that they would all be privatized at the point, and I didn't know this fully at the time, but it was piqued my interest, was just like nuts. So then you have basically middle class doctors going out and confronting U.S. trained military police and police special forces units, shooting at them with live ammunition and tear gas, right? And to me at the time, I was like, wow, that's insane. And why do we not hear about that as much? Like that's the kind of thing that if it happened in Venezuela, we would hear about, to some degree or another, right? So that summer, I went, I on my own money, just like saved up and just got just enough to go to Honduras. I missed actually the two waves of protests that year, but nonetheless, I met a bunch of people. I like kind of fell in love with Honduras because like I don't know, and I've thought about why. Like I don't know, people are just good vibes here. They're really fun, and then also it's the fact that Honduras is like it's bigger than El Salvador. I think it's way less studied and reported on than the other countries, right? And I just really like the people. Like they're just a fucking good time. And so then I came back in 2019 again when my senior year of college to actually to this place where I am right now, the Bahuaguan. And that's where I started really starting getting like deeper sources in movements kind of fighting extractivism. And basically, I didn't understand at the time, but like the very real dirty wars that are unleashed, which are particularly intense in Honduras because of capitalism, imperialism, the US, all that shit, right? But, exist across Latin America and you could say the South too. And so like I started reporting on that. I started reporting on this anti-mine struggle. And then like when you start really getting deep into that and you see how fucked up it is, but then you also meet these people who have these incredible fucking stories. So basically, fast forward year after that, pandemic happens. It's just a blank year for everyone, right? But then at the beginning of 2021, I moved down here, so started getting deeper on reporting, doing more stuff on like Garifuna, reporting a lot in the Bahuaguan, and then by that point, doing investigative stuff on like paramilitary groups tied to like the U.S. supported security apparatus here. Then I would later do other investigations over the past few years. I'm just fast forwarding because I don't want to talk too long, right? um, Doing other investigations because it takes time. I think like you really just have to kind of put in the legwork to actually do investigative stuff. And any like New York Times correspondent who says that they're like a genius is actually full of shit because hey, they have like a kind of quasi colonial mindset of like they just are smarter than all the people in these places and they can figure out stuff faster than them. But nonetheless, like so after a few years, I started to be able to do more investigative stuff. And I've also developed a lot of really close friendships just with like people who are purely friends and then also with sources who I actually think you should kind of treat as friends insofar as it's possible, because that's actually being a nice human and being respectful, right? So yeah, and I've developed. Then I shifted up to Mexico, right, to Mexico City for a variety of reasons that I could get into, right. But I've kept working a lot in Honduras, except for this last year. Now I'm back, and I'm going to spend more time this year. But I, kept working a lot in Honduras and kind of keeping this link. And honestly, it's like so close to my heart, and it's the place where I like reporting most. And yeah, I love it. So I hope that was a good answer. And I know that took like
No.
15 minutes, but
No, but I love it because I feel like we were able to know, like, it started from an interest. You know what I mean? Like, because I feel like a lot of time people will be like, "Well, why is X, Y, and Z person is reporting on me?" You know what I mean? Like, it's not someone like who's gonna go with the camera just because randomly it goes. You know what I mean? Like, you were actually interested in knowing more because since a very young age.
yeah. And I mean, I think that like I don't know. Yeah, sometimes like people like to have a sort of mythology. Like if you're not from a
Hmm.
place, right? And
Mhm.
like any like especially any white person, but like anyone who reports on Latin America who's not from there, oftentimes I feel like especially in Mexico City, they'll like develop some like elaborate mythology for like why they like felt called to come to Colombia or whatever. And
Hmm.
honestly, I just think sometimes it's like because you thought it was cool and because it was interesting, and then you because ideally you liked the people there and you started learning about it.
Hmm.
So I mean, that's the short answer. Like I thought it was super cool, both for the fascinating, like the kind of dark things that need to be reported on, but also because it's like beautiful and like the people are great, and baleadas are really good. Um,
They're our
I
favorite too.
so.
Oh yeah, I mean, no, I think that's the way you summarized. I mean, I know it's a lot. I mean, you have a big trajectory from college to, present day, so I understand. But also, it's just it's really amazing to hear that you were very connected with the people. And that's something that's
Hmm.
very important, and especially I'm assuming I'm not a journalist, but in reporting, it's like connecting with people, being able to get their stories and also just, showcasing it to the world because like you mentioned, it's not something that is in our mainstream media. Like if we,
Hmm.
even with, for example, going back to Juan Orlando, I'm sure not a lot of people know that Juan Orlando is currently in U.S. custody,
Hmm.
serving time for his crimes, and they probably don't even know that he was U.S. backed uh, for a really long time. So, it's like stuff like that. Like that's why it's so important for us to have journalists like you, even though you may be an outsider. It's you've connected with community, you found purpose in that, and being able to do that, like honestly, again, like we mentioned previously, we thank you for that.
yeah, well, I'm glad. I hope it helps. I mean, something funny I've thought about journalistically too, and I was actually
Hmm.
talking about this with my friend last night when we were here.
Yeah.
Like talking about some projects that that we want to work on, and that like thinking about on like both the kinds of coverage that's subsidized of these sort of places, and it's not just limited to Honduras, right? But
Hmm.
then that also, as a journalist, it can and often does, unfortunately, shape how you see these places. And then I think it's really important to break out of it. Is that like I don't think you should actually forget that like you have an ethical responsibility if there's human rights
Hmm.
abuses or whatever that you're supposed to write about them. If there's violence, you're supposed to write about them. If that's what you want.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that like there's this thing that happens though, where like especially with a kind of parachute culture of a lot of journalists who come in, right? Like talking because you were mentioning the stuff about having relationships with people in places like this.
Hmm.
There's this sort of parachute culture where first of all, like someone from the New York Times, right? And actually, I don't
Hmm.
know if you would know about this story, but you could look deep enough. There's some really bad
Hmm.
stories about the New York Times,
Yep.
and some of them like terrible. Um, I know like some of the people who were involved in that, and it's like even worse than what was publicly. But anyways, like that kind of like proto colonialist, not even to abuse the word because genuinely is that way. This idea that journalists come in first of all and they just assume that everyone's like stupid and that they don't know what's going on,
Hmm.
and that as like, oh, I just flew in from Mexico City or New York City or London
Hmm.
or whatever, and like I'm a objective journalist and I have a kind of godlike precision to understand what's going on here, right? And so first of all, like I feel like when you don't have those connections with people, not even just because like I think that you should actually just have connections with the humans because it's fun and it's nice, right?
Hmm.
But also journalistically, I feel like you start to miss out on a lot of stuff, because you actually don't, when you don't take people seriously. Like, I've continuously learned so much not interviewing people, and like I like to interview people or whatever, but in
Mhm.
like all the in between kind of moments, like hanging out with people, right?
Mhm.
Having salvalidas or whatever, like way too late and like way too many, but like stuff like that, right? And there's this other thing that think happens too, which I've tried to think about, again, not cutting away from the ethical imperative to write about human rights abuses and the powerful people that are behind them. But like, and I think that this, like, I mean, I've never reported in like Africa or anything like that, or the Middle East, but I'm sure that there's like some variation of this there, where
Mhm.
if people report on it the wrong way, you can kind of just see it as this like unending and incorrigible scenery of carnage, where it's just like, look at the savagery of the brown people on the periphery, right? And then if you forget, like, and I know that this is kind of roundabout, people actually have lives and they have fun and they have like personalities and they have like
Mhm.
things that they want to do with their life. They actually have like whole freaking lives that are interesting and worthwhile and worth knowing about, and that's why the horrible human rights abuses are to be written about, and that needs to be juxtaposed against that, right? And I think that a lot of times a lot of journalists come in and they basically, especially because like every fucking journalist, and forgive me, I don't know if I should not be swearing as much,
Mhm.
uh,
No, no, go for it.
every journalist wants to come in like, I got hit up by a journalist who, it's not even, there's no point in naming who she is, right? But she's
Mhm.
like won international awards and very clearly on her social media positions herself as like being super cool or whatever. And she reaches out to me asking, she's a staffer, and she asks me for contacts, and I'm just like, oh god, I'm not going to give you my contacts, I'm a freelancer. But it was also telling because she does something that a lot of people do. She's like, I want to come to Honduras and I want to write about gangs. And I'm like, oh, you and the other like 5,000 people who've come in and just basically
Mhm.
want to do a story about the tattooed guys with pistols, as if there's nothing else important going on in the country.
Mhm.
So I'm rambling again. I got off on a tangent, but I just think that it all comes back to like, it's actually really important, yeah, to like get to know people and have friendships with people, because then you can actually see the kind of context in which the bad things happen, which is usually they're bad because people have
Yeah.
great lives, and well, not great lives, but you know what I'm getting at, right?
Yeah.
They're people.
No, no, yeah.
I think it's
Yeah, but I
really
feel, oh,
cool. Oh, sorry.
oh,
You go
no,
ahead.
no, no, go for it. Go for it. Go for it.
I think it's really cool too because it provides humanity.
Mhm.
Humanity to the people, like the stories that you're actually writing about, which is something that's missed in all these other, journalists who like just come in and try to be like, "Oh, this is what I saw," or "This is what they told me, and here's my story, and give me, like my prize." It's like, no, that gives humanity to those stories, and it's
Mhm.
just like you can't get deeper than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
And
think like even I'm gonna
Mhm.
um like shit on one book, and I haven't read it, and I've heard that it
Mhm.
like has got some fine investigative aspects or whatever. But the book that was written, I think like 2015, there's like a handful of English language books on Honduras, like by journalists, but Arce's book, Blood Barrios, like the title just gives me like shivers down my back. I'm like, come on, man! Like it's not,
mhm.
all of this stuff is terrible, right? And the fact that so many people have to leave, right? And the fact that so many
Mhm.
people are incapable of having nice, clean rivers, and they can't have nice schools or whatever, right? Um, that can't just be reduced to like, this place is full of savagery and violence and bloodshed. And I think that that's one of the things that were a lot of journalists, they kind of like, they miss that. And it's like, I think it's maybe, I don't want to say it's like easy to miss at first, but then like you spend enough time and you're like, oh wow, people are really just kind of actually justifying the sort of omniscience and continuation of systems of violence that they're supposed to actually be picking apart, and then showing the other side of things that are being screwed over by that, not just like,
Mhm.
let's look at the endless, carnival of, hopeless violence, right?
Yeah, and I think like, I mean, you have mentioned so many things that I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Because it's like I am the person who I always said like, Honduras, I'm Honduran myself. Like, we're more than gangs. And of one of the many reasons for me, myself personally, I went into filmmaking is because I hated every time I said I'm from Honduras. Oh, MS-13. That was the first thing people know that. You know what I mean? It's like, and it's like we're more than that. You know what I mean? We're human beings, and and I think there's a relation of like when you say about like reporting, about connection, about community, and getting to know these people like a lot. people in Honduras and in all these country communities, like you said, they have life. They don't want to leave. They have things to enjoy, and it's not about only gangs, violence, and and of course there's a lot of human rights violation, but I think like the way you approach it is how I would say much more journalists should do it. And I would just kind of like connect it to like, I think what Brenda and I also do is filmmaking. And 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 I say this because a lot of time as a filmmaker, we have to do research on stories that we have to do, and a lot of times we base it on journalism. You know what I mean? So if most journalists are doing gang related, research in this country, what do you think the media we're gonna get? Name it any, like in Honduras, I cannot find any other film that it does not involve gangs. Like, it's sad. It's sad. So it's like it is all connected when it comes to journalists and media and the mainstream media. And you were talking about like journalists just trying to go there for talk about like report on gangs or even like a big newspapers. It's like you don't get to know the deeper cause of of what is even the system of gangs. You don't get to know what is the cause or many causes of migration. You just get to criminalize like a whole community based on what you think it is, just because this little grain that you think this country is.
Yeah, and like I mean, I have so many thoughts off of that. Like I could go ahead
Mhm.
and like I have a terrible problem with tangents. But like one of the things, even just we don't have to talk about this right now, but something even from a purely journalistic standpoint, and I actually think this is a broader pattern in Latin America, and
Mhm.
I've like coverage of Latin America, and I've been thinking about it a lot. Is that gangs are really low hanging fruit in the systems of violence here. Like if you actually, like they're often the
Mhm.
immediate face of violence, right? So I'm not here being like, actually gangs are fine. Like no, it sucks, right? And it makes people's lives really difficult. But they're
Mhm.
not actually the people with the controls and the levers of power. Like, I can't
Mhm.
tell you how many times I've seen news stories that have some derivative title of like Honduras held hostage by gangs. And I'm like, Honduras held hostage by the US backed army and World Bank backed elite, because like that's
Mhm.
actually where the power is coming from, right?
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I could get lost in that because I kind of, I go really down the rabbit hole on some of those subjects. But then the subtext of that, I think, too, is that like this is where I think you see it all across Latin America. I think in the kind of post Cold War era of the drug wars, right?
Mhm.
And I hope that we can get to a point where we don't even need to say
Mhm.
like the quote unquote drug wars because that's never been what it's about. It's always about waging a war on the people, right? Not to be
Mhm.
hyperbolic, but I actually think that's what it is. Is that we're taught, and I like, I can't speak for like what it's like in the diaspora community or whatever, but like in journalism, you're always kind of taught to look down in terms of understanding of violence. Like, oh, like the violence is all coming from the poor people, and like the perpetual obsession with like the sight of like a tattooed, like malnourished kid who has like a sixth grade education and like a gun that barely works, like that's not where the problems of the world come from. It's like pure and unabashed classism.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
anyways,
No, I mean you're completely correct, because I have this conversation with my mom. My mom always says, es que la violencia se tiene que cortar. El árbol se tiene que dar vuelta. Because a lot of people are like, oh, the root of cause is like gangs. It's like, no, it's honestly people, the government, and you just have to flip the tree and cut it from there.
yeah, I mean, totally. And, you know, again, I mean, I could go on forever about that. I don't want to get too much into a tangent and
No.
like change the whole subject of the podcast about something
I
that like
think,
pisses me off.
um, I'm so sorry. I think that actually one of the questions we had
Yeah.
was what were some of the biggest misconceptions you encountered about Honduras and Central America. So I think we covered that question through this. Yeah, and just kind of like how international media reports on it and how they see it. So yeah, I think everything you said right now answers that question.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about something, to
Mhm.
add to it too is like, I think, like one of the things you realize, and at least for me, like I can't unsee it, is that like, and also what's interesting, like it's sad, but it's also has like a seed of like, sort of like if you can recognize it, and many people do, like especially a lot of social movements in Latin America can unpack this sort of discourse and then create new ways of seeing how like global power structures work, is that like so much of, I think, like post Cold War Latin America, or let's just say like post 2000s, and especially so
Mhm.
after the coup in Honduras, you've realized once you start really looking at it how securitarian all the perceptions of conflict and violence are, right? And basically, the subtext of every kind of, I don't know how it is. I haven't watched enough like movies about it or whatever, right? But I know in journalism well and in documentaries well that the kind of subtext of everything is the state is weak, and we need to send them more guns because the criminals are out of control, and like, then why haven't
Mhm.
they taken over yet, man? Like, why do we still see like now Nayib Bukele is like, I don't know if he's exactly what's going to happen in the whole region, but he's one pocket of a kind of, I think, a larger
Mhm.
thing of going on of like, oh, we spent years talking about how like these governments were weak and didn't have anything, and that slid right back into military dictatorship. And I think that's
Mhm.
kind of because we're taught to think that states are weak and that criminals, cough cough classism, cough cough racism, right? That
Mhm.
criminals are just overrunning everything. And I think it's so important as journalists to try to undo that.
How is important to have, like, independent journalism, and not only independent, but like that journalism from a point of view from the people, you know what I mean, like the people who you get connections with, the people like that you get to see, and you're like, oh, like, actually that's not correct, you know what I mean, like you shouldn't be going through the struggle, this human, this is human right violation. And how these stories get, honestly, like not showcased for, in mainstream media, and a lot of times not in international media, right? Because it's like, who cares? I don't care. Like, I don't care about the little country over there. And that's how a lot of times this, people from outside of Central America think, like, how does that matter to me? How does that even connect to me? But like, we have talked in this thing, and we know that it's all connected, and it's like, well, you can be here in the United States and thinking that the little country is not connected to you. It's very much connected.
Yeah, I mean, like Central America developed the U.S., against its own
Hmm.
will, right? Like the reason whatever,
Hmm.
your shitty T-shirt at Walmart is so cheap, or fast fashion or whatever. I'm sure that that's a thing in San Pedro Sula and La Ceiba or whatever.
Hmm.
It's because a
Mhm.
woman in La Ceiba who probably has to, deals with all sorts of crap in her life,
Hmm.
gets treated like dirt in a maquiladora in La Ceiba, right? And so, like, I feel like I struggle. I don't know. What do you guys? I don't
Mhm.
want to ramble too much. What do you guys think? Because I struggle sometimes. Like, how can you try to, like, for the people who would even have open ears to care about that? Like,
Hmm.
how do you try to connect that? Because I've, like, as a journalist, I've really been struggling with that, especially like Trump's now president again, to get people to be like, look, like, you don't need to personally feel bad, but like places like Central America are struggling so much, not by accident. They're struggling because your bananas are so cheap, because your shirt is so cheap.
True. Yeah.
What have you guys thought about that?
I mean, for me, I think a lot of times comes for, like, I think we said it at the beginning, is like be interested in it, right? If you're interested to know, I have friends that, they're not from Honduras or any type of relation to Latin America or Central America, and they're like, can you tell me why are you here? Why you're so open talking about Central America? And I told them, well, you know what? Like, my mom lost her job after everything that happened in the coup, and I had to go to Central America. Why, about, like, and then I started talking about, like, the bananas, and then the maquilas, and then the what happened with the Juan Orlando. And it's like, they're like, oh, I didn't know that, and it's
Mhm.
like that puts a seed of, like, interest. But if that person is interested in it, you know what I mean? And if they want to learn what is going on, because here with Brenda and I, we live here in LA, and I think we have a closer connection to the Salvadoran community and to the Mexican community, and we know what is going on in El Salvador. We know what's going on in Mexico, and because our neighbors and everything, it's affecting them, even though they're in the diaspora. But like, there's just a handful of people who will look at us and be like, oh, actually, let me can you tell me
Mhm.
something about your country, right? And a lot of the times is also about social media, right? Like, I feel like both of us has been very, like, sharing about our experience, sharing about, like, um in my case, like my diaspora, like in films and in other areas, like for example this podcast, because of the same thing. Like I told you, this podcast was created for that, because I, as when I was living here, I couldn't find those same story or the same connection to someone, um you know, find this type of stories or this type of like topics in places. So I was like, oh, why not creating a podcast and talk to people who and bring the stories to here. And a lot of people who listen to this, they are finding this because they're interested in, they want to know what's going on. Oh, I didn't know this is why my dad migrated. Oh, I didn't know this is why so and so talks to, went through this. Or I didn't know why my Nicaraguan friend cannot return to Nicaragua. Or like I didn't know, it's they found this thing because they're interested in, and it's just if they are. And I think coming back to what you said, like it you were interested in and very curious about Latin America and Central America, and that's why you delve into it. And I think it's like only if they're open minded, they are curious about it. But it's honestly very hard with someone who doesn't want to see it, and there's someone who honestly they're just self-centered. It's very hard. They're like, okay, like if prácticamente like si no me afecta, like I don't care. And with those type of people, it's kind of hard to have a conversation and
Yeah.
open about politics and everything, and like international relationships.
Yeah, like it's always the most random people too. I've found like it's like sometimes like I always think in my head of like my really annoying like fascist family members, which is not all of them, thankfully.
Mhm.
Some of them are only like annoying centrists, whatever, who have like convinced that migrants are not terrible people. But like I think of them and I'm like I always get really pissed off about them. But then like sometimes with those people, I feel like it's a waste. Or it's not like always a waste, but it's like you're really just expending energy for not enough returns. But then there's like the most random people like have reached out to me or whatever, like just being genuinely curious. And I'm like, I would have never guessed that like you would actually be curious. And you actually seem to like you're like a Republican coded guy who like posts about NFL, but then you're asking me genuinely about it. You know what I mean? And like a lot of times, like I don't know, I feel like some of those people actually will hear you out. I don't know. What do you think, Brenda?
Yeah, no, I mean, kind of like adding to it, yeah, I think that's a topic that comes up a lot, especially with migration. People asking like, "Oh, like, but why do they want to move to, the States? Like, what's going on in Honduras?" It's like at that point, it's like, there's that's the question. That's the question that's the one that you should start diving into. Why is it that people are migrating, and how even the US is responsible for those migrations happening, and how, our society is so blinded to that. Something that I grew up, especially going to Honduras as a kid, we would get shirts. So was it Tommy Hilfiger, and it's like, oh yeah, they have the company in San Pedro. It's like, oh, so cool. But if you think about it, it goes back to like
Mhm.
how the low cost of labor, like, in order to create that shirt and make it happen and then send it to the US and sell it for like, I don't even know, it's like 30 times the cost of what it costs to, pay that person, pay the product. And it's just a harsh reality. It's something that if you don't want to see it, you won't, you can turn a blind eye, you won't see it. But again, going back to immigration, I mean, my father, he moved to the States because of poverty, and that's an ongoing topic that shows up for a lot of people, poverty. And it's like, oh, why, and it's again accountability. I think that a lot of governments, especially the US, they're like, oh yeah, we're sending money, to Honduras, to El Salvador, Guatemala, whichever countries, and then there's no accountability. It's like, where is that money going to?
Yeah, that
Mhm.
money is like going into USAID so that they can like give either useless bullshit kind of like
Yeah,
capacitaciones to
yeah,
unidades policiales ejecutando gente,
yeah.
or to like paint a
Mhm.
school and then have like one of those like obnoxiously proto-colonialist photos of like a smiling white guy with like a bunch of ethnic
It's like,
children in front of their painted school,
Mhm.
which now their lives are going to be better. You know what I mean? Like it's
hmm
what's funny? There's like this is somewhat tangential to that. Think about maquiladores
hmm
and stuff like that. Because I was like, I and this like applies to so much of like just the North and the South globally.
Mhm.
It's same difference in Philippines and Indonesia and stuff like that. But I was on a plane from, and it was actually really comical. I was on a plane from Fort Lauderdale once to San Pedro Sula, and I was reading the
Mhm.
book in Spanish. I don't know if you've read Adrian Pine's book on Honduras, Sobrevivir Honduras, or Working Hard, Drinking Hard in English. I actually think it's like one of the best English language books, and it doesn't like slip into the kind of like savagery and violence kind of tropes or whatever. Like it really thoughtfully talks about the growth of maquiladoras, and then the growth of the kind of new post Cold War security apparatus, which included Maras
Yeah.
as much as it did with like the
Mhm.
state security forces. But anyway, super interesting book, and I was reading it on the flight, and there was this like 50-something-year-old Honduran woman who's super enthusiastic, and she'd been in the U.S. for a while. But this comes back to the point of like how I think it's like so ridiculous. Like it's just
Mhm.
Mhm.
savage how these companies come to these places and just so blatantly think that they can treat people like dirt and pay them nothing, right? Because, and this
Mhm.
is where it's funny. So I was talking with her a little bit and I was trying to read. I like to talk. I talk too much, but I was generally trying to read on this flight, but she was just such an enthusiastic Honduran lady. And she was like, oh, wow, vienes para mi país, ¿a dónde vas? Ah, qué chingón. Not chingón, that's Mexican.
Mhm.
I've absorbed too much Mexican stuff. But, uh, you know, and so we were talking, and she asked about the book, and I was like, sometimes people ask about a political book, right? And um, you kind of have to like tone it down because you don't know if they're going to agree with it or not. So I was like, bueno, es una historia de como maquiladoras y el desarrollo capitalista de Honduras or whatever. And she was like, wow, that sounds so interesting. And I'm like, cool. But then, so in the row in front of us, and she starts talking when we're getting off in San Pedro Sula, is this Canadian maquiladora motherfucker. And then, so she says, and I hear her say, my friend was reading a book about maquiladoras in San Pedro Sula. You should talk to him. And so we're getting off the flight, and this guy goes running so fast from me, like not looking at me. And I'm like, you know why? Because he knows it's fucked up. You know what I mean? Like, there is no way in hell that he heard that and was like, oh, yeah, I'd love to tell him about it. He's like, oh shit, he's going to give me shit because I participate in an apartheid system that's predicated on some people being more than others, right? So
Oh
yeah,
my god. Yeah, because they know what they're doing.
Mhm.
exactly. Like I wish that guy, if he wasn't a coward bitch, right? If he had stopped, I wish I could have been like, oh yeah, so like you know, how are you, what are the wages you're paying them or whatever, right? And how are their
Mhm.
healthcare benefits and are you making sure whatever? Because he wouldn't give me an answer. He would. Yeah, so like with that ridiculous anecdote that I love, mostly because I mean, this guy is a coward and he can't admit that, his whole job is based on like the devaluation and the basically the kind of assumption that some people are worth less than others and deserve to be paid like 10 times less, than other people in the world. Whatever. And it's also funny because the older woman just being so enthusiastic, right? But so anyways, I've been doing this project for several years, which finally resold, and it's going to come out in the New York Review of Books in about a month or two.
Oh no.
And basically, as a part of that, I've been following these human smugglers from Honduras, right? I
Mhm.
despise the use of the word human traffickers. It's a whole misconception, right?
Yeah.
But they're just like, they're part of the transnational network that's created by apartheid, right? Of
Mhm.
people need to move to live. And so they work in that. So, anyways, I've just been getting close to these people. And as a part of that, I find it really interesting. I still don't know how to make a sense of this, but there's this thing in Honduras I think about, and it has to do with the whole history of like imperialism, U.S. imperialism, and like internalizing a lot of the values that I feel like historically the country was beat down by. But the conception of work, right? Like what work is worthwhile or whatever, and
Mhm.
like especially I just know because I've spent a lot of time in San Pedro Sula, like San Jamperanos are like so many people for all their idiosyncrasies as people in common. Everyone's like just like trabajador, I'm fucking
Mhm.
working all the time and stuff like that, right? So I don't have any like fixed thesis about, anthropologically what are the conceptions of work in Honduras, right? But I
Mhm.
do find it interesting and it honestly makes me really sad. So like I get to know this guy who has a fascinating story and now he's in Sonora. And so I've been going to Sonora a lot up in Mexico, the Sonoran Desert, to like see that side of the equation where Hondurans who are undocumented in Mexico end up in these kind of criminal spaces, right? But not because they're criminals, just because that's what happens with apartheid. And his mom is like the spitting image of the humble, good, hardworking Honduran, right?
Mhm.
She's got her like four or five kids, plus now like almost as many grandkids. She basically takes care of all of them herself because the husband's kind of a piece of shit, right? Which whatever.
Mhm.
But then she works in a maquiladora. She worked. Um, and I find it really funny because, if you would compare, especially in the US too, not just within Honduras and the kind of internalized classism that I think I see or whatever, but in the US, right? What are the two candidates and how would they be perceived, right, in terms of their acceptance, like the idea of like who's a good migrant and who isn't, right?
Mhm.
And it's weird because on the one hand, the guy who's this human smuggler, and I'm not getting too much into that story, right?
Mhm.
He's a devious criminal, an undesirable, right, who's thrown himself, but he lives pretty well, right? And because that's where if you are at the bottom rung globally in terms of
Mhm.
class, in terms of race or whatever, the spaces where you can rise up. It's not like if you're like a white guy like me, I could go to Lockheed Martin and rise up, right? But if you're in this space, you probably go to a criminalized industry, right? And then so his mom is like, and she's so sweet, right? And there's more to her than just this. This is just one aspect of the crap that she has to put up with. She works at a maquiladora, and she was, making sewing military uniforms for a Canadian slash South Korean sweatshop company that would then be given to the U.S. military, right? And I mean, it's soul sucking work. She's got like carpal tunnel syndrome, right?
Mhm.
Um, but then so when I went to meet her, because I was like, you know what, I want to go like hang out with this guy's family, and I want to see what's up in La Ceiba, right? And she lives up in this kind of really like colonia muy fea up in La Ceiba, And so we go there, and this like ties back to some of what we were saying previously. Like, I don't actually
Mhm.
think people are more than the shitty circumstances they're stuck living in, right?
Mhm.
So like, you wouldn't have known that there's like a huge gang problem and urban violence problem where she lives, kind of like this favela style neighborhood, right? Because you know what? When I meet her, she wants to talk about how, and I can't personally relate to this, because I'm a dude and we're all slobs, right? She wants to talk to me about how she's decorated her house and show me how she's like made her house look
Mhm.
really good and
Mhm.
stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
It's like she wants to show if she's like, oh, you're talking about my son. Oh, he's so great. I don't like him being a smuggler, but and so she's showing me that, right? And she only like in the bare minimum, she's like, oh, roll down the windows. There's mareros, right? Because you have to live with that. But then, anyways, and I just like I've found this so sad and tragic and poetic, because she has her own life and personality and stuff that she likes, right? She likes her kids and she's like this decorating and she likes stupid gossip about people in the community, whatever. And then, of course, it was tragic because then that night, we got stuck there because there was a whole ass firefight between the gangs, like three
Mhm.
blocks below. And so I just ended up staying with them because, the whole place is immobilized because you can't move around because there's a bunch of teenagers with, um, AK-47s and ARs that come from the US, literally come from the
Mhm.
US, killing each other, right? And then she works at this maquiladora for I forget exactly how much money she makes, but it was so sad because after all of that, and we had a great time except for the hour-long terror of that woman. I went and dropped her off at the morning at 6 in the morning, right? And it was just so like deadening. Like I feel like, especially coming from like a middle class, predominantly white space in the U.S., you don't understand how not just like oh you're not getting paid enough, right? But how
Mhm.
like much of an insult to like human creativity and your soul it is to basically go
Mhm.
into this factory where it looks like a factory farm and except instead of being cows that are going to be killed it's just like the brown people that they're going to yell at to work harder, right? And she's talking
Yeah.
about and she herself is trying to be like, well, you're supposed to work hard or whatever, and I see that as being like very Honduran and in both some senses is good but then some senses I see it as
Mhm.
really sad, right? She's like, well, I work really hard to take care of my family and stuff, and she does. And but she's like, but the bosses, the gringo bosses, they're really shitty, But I don't think about it. And so like here she is with this stress in her community. She wants to live her own life. And then I'm dropping her off at 6:15 in the morning for this terrible job. And then the denouement to all of this, and she's like trying to kind of rationalize like why
Telling
it's
me.
okay. Because what else is she supposed to do? Is she supposed to
Mhm.
become criminalized like her son? She's supposed to go to the US and be criminalized there. And you know what happens? The company heard rumors of a unionization drive, shut the whole factory, and moved it to Bukele's El Salvador. And she was left out of work. Like it was
No.
so in the most fucked up way, And it's like it's so it's not just like it's like the crime of like oh you're not getting paid enough and you deserve to like get
Mhm.
paid. It's the crime of like your life is being stolen from you and your creativity and your relationships and your ability to like do something meaningful and worthwhile. And so yeah, I don't know. I just I don't even know how I got started with that. Maquiladoras. It's not just that people aren't getting paid enough; they're getting abused. It's that their lives
Mhm.
are being stolen from them, and that's the
Yeah.
responsible, the respectable kind of thing to do. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think I had a conversation when my dad still lives in Honduras about maquilas because, um, again, it's like they have the same mindset that you just mentioned, right? Like, oh, like, pues hay que trabajar, like if, at least they have a job. And I was like, okay, I understand. Like, yeah, they have a job, but like, that's not, you know, like they're paying them pennies literally. And like you said, it's very demanding, and like you see elderly people working, but like they have like carpetono or whatever the circumstances is. And
Mhm.
then my dad often will say like, in that conversation that I was having with him was like, well, would you prefer that, or would you prefer not having them a job, for them not having a job? And I was like, it's not that, it's that like these companies come and abuse our people for pennies, and they get to leave whenever they want, but
Yeah.
like there's not jobs in our country for them. You know what I mean? Like a 60-year-old, a 65-year-old lady shouldn't be waking up 6 a.m. to go to a maquiladora to get pennies. You know what I mean? Like in a sense, it's not the way of like, well, if this maquiladoras or this call centers wouldn't exist, like no tuvieran trabajo. It's not that. It's like these companies go to our countries and pay like pennies, and like and I'm using pennies because I don't know the exact amount, but it's very low, and then they can leave whenever they want. Like Chiquita, I don't know, I think they're leaving, I don't even know, and they did a whole damage in a whole region, right? And like so like what I mean is like in our country, and there's this culture, what you said, like, oh, but like it's about working, it's about hard work, and then at least I'm working, and then um I'm I'm providing for my family. It's not that that's bad, it's just that this company has taken advantage for people that want to just work and give up for their families, and they're giving up their livelihood, their like their soul, technically, like if and then is that these people are giving up their livelihood, their life, and like you said, maybe creativity, maybe they could have done something else, but no, like this companies just decide to sanction all that just for a profit, and yeah, it's just that sad reality when it comes to maquilas, when it comes to all those places.
Yeah, like I think you know what's funny too, because I've been thinking a lot, like trying to, and I think it's important. Like if you care about these things, you go in multiple cycles in
Mm-hmm.
your life trying to reconsider like fundamental questions,
Mm-hmm.
and one of them is like global apartheid and inequality. Like I don't think that's controversial to say with you guys.
Mm-hmm.
That it's apartheid, this kind of system of borders and global
Mm-hmm.
capitalism or whatever. And it's like I've been thinking about what we've been going on a lot, and I have so many anecdotes that make me think about this in Honduras, right? Where it's not just that, again, people are stripped of like a dignified compensation so that they can rest well and sleep well and eat well. It's that like they are prevented from the full flourishing of the human experience. Like, I remember this one really sweet story. When I was taking a bus, I used to, because again, I'm always like super broke. So then when I kind of relocated to Mexico City and I'd come to Honduras a lot, I had to kind of stay out a little bit this last year until I'm here now. But I was with this guy on the bus from San Salvador to Deus, right? Because the flights are always cheaper
Mm-hmm.
to San Salvador, even though it usually means you have to run into Bitcoin bros and they just suck. But
Mm-hmm.
whatever. That's part of why I actually haven't really reported there as much because I don't know if I could stand it. Eventually, I'm sure I will, but like for example, I think so. I ran into this guy. And he's like in his 40s, he's a Honduran, like he and his bro like just went to Mexico or whatever, like middle class, insofar as middle class is Honduran, right? um they'd gone to Mexico or whatever, and like he'd gotten some job, like with it he was able to stay and live somewhat decently in Honduras, like an engineering job or whatever, right? And one of the things I think about, because I love books and I like buy too many books, and now like I've had to limit myself with getting too many books this year, right? But I appreciate, yeah, I love books, and so like I think about how this guy we were talking, and he like knows that I'm a journalist, and he's like, oh wow, that's so cool. I have this book I wrote, and it was so sweet, and actually I still have the copy of it, where he self-published this book. He did this research on the indigenous history, like ancient up to indigenous history of Honduras or whatever. And it was clear that, even if it didn't have the kind of academic refinement, even if it didn't have the sort of like polished prose, and especially because he doesn't have either a PhD to develop that, like access to that, or like a fancy publishing house like you'd get in the US, he can't really like he basically paid to like self-publish 30 copies of this book where he just had to wing it on his own, right? And I think to myself, like, back to that same question of that global inequality, like, man, like I'm so happy this guy at least got to self-publish his book, and he like spent, it was really sweet. He spent like 2 hours talking to me about it on the way to Davis or whatever.
Mhm.
And then I felt bad because I was like getting tired, but I still have the copy, and I'm like, how many writers, like incredibly fascinating writers, are there in a place like Honduras who you never get to hear about because it's already so difficult to get through like corporate publishing houses in the US. Now
Mhm.
imagine in
Yeah.
Honduras. And then the people in these countries oftentimes who do get to publish are total douches. They're just like the richest kids, who like grew up in Miami, like especially in Mexico. I don't know if you've seen some of the literary squabbles about like Whitexicans in
Mhm.
Mexico. I've started to see some of it.
Mhm.
Um, but like the biggest douches in the world will then get to dominate the already enfeebled and limited literary scene. And I'm like, man, there's probably so many cool writers in all of these places. And because there's not enough like education just to like bring out those talents, and there's not enough publishing houses, there's not a, I don't know, I just, that really kills me too.
Yeah.
So that was a long ramble, but just thinking about that,
No, but I think it is very true. Just kind of like piggybacking from that, I do know someone from my town, and I actually interviewed them here in the podcast. That he published a book in Reytoca in Honduras, and and then in that interview that I had with him, he was telling how like he had to learn how to even put it on Amazon, so people who are out of the town, Retoca, can buy it. And my mom was one
Mm.
of the first one who was like buy it. And like you said, like, and he explains how like he wanted, and it's a book of poems, and all those poems is about this town that again, it's very personal, of course, to me, but like it's love letters about the town, right? And it's like, and he talks about how like, oh, like he has been trying to study and like go to Tegucigalpa, from the town to Tegucigalpa, to try to like you know get his degree, and it's like this back and forward, and then in the midst of that, like he's writing his poems, and then like he then decided, what, I want to publish it, and then it goes through this thing, and it's like what you said, like it's sometimes um you know props to a person, like that, like, oh, he actually went through that. But it's like, what it would happen if that would have that if something like, like a job would suck that creativity away, you know what I mean, or like company would suck that. At least he what I'm trying to say is that I feel like I'm going the whole ramble, but what I'm trying to say is like there's so many talents in these countries, and so many like writers, so many people who have talent to give to the world, but sometimes this company just steal it from us, and you have a story, and then I have a story, so I don't know, your story just reminded me of the guy. But what I wanted to ask, is there any projects that you're working on right now, or like any other stories or things that you're working, like your future plans anytime soon?
so in terms of projects that I'm working on right now, they have to do with Honduras. So there's this long project where I kind of like walked into this like access with like basically the human smuggler networks of mostly Hondurans up in the Sonoran Desert, right? And that's going to be a long piece now. I did it for one publication, which I probably shouldn't say. It's like very well
Mhm.
respected, but then you start working for them and you realize they actually suck and they treat most of the writers like dirt. So they held my work from me for like almost a year, and then like just out of nowhere cut it and gave me like 20% of what they were supposed to pay me. So I was so pissed off and sad because I really loved this story, and I met this guy actually here in El Bahuawan.
Mhm.
And I could get into the whole meaning of the story, but I think I'll just like brush over it, and then it'll come out when it comes out. Um, when he was fleeing, it's interesting. So his mom is kind of the spitting image of like the hardworking Honduran, right? Like the woman who has to deal with all this crap with all these kids, right? If you want to be real Marxist, my girlfriend keeps saying I need to read Sylvia Federici, and I'll eventually get to it, right? But like, who does all the social reproduction of life in the house, and then works in a sweatshop until the sweatshop's like, oh, you guys are going to unionize, fuck you, and then whatever. So,
Mhm.
but she's the good Honduran, and then like, what does that do for her life, right? Her son kind of does, if you can maybe make like a loose triangle of the things that you do, like the good Honduran working on the African palm plantation for, an evil corporation or a maquiladora or whatever. Or, so her son at first was join one of these land cooperatives, right? Where, I mean, like these, basically, people organize and have organized for, 15 years now to try to take back land that was stolen from them, very blatantly stolen from them, and they have to live through these savage, dirty wars, which is what they are, right? Either tolerated or directly sanctioned by the state. And so he did that, try to change the world instead of just being like his mom who just works hard, right? He tries to change the world. And what does that do for him? Like five of his friends are murdered, right? Including two sources that I knew really well who were assassinated after he left, right?
Wow.
So what does that do for him? You want to change the world? Like I can hear so many, some ignorant person in the US being like, well, why don't they fix their countries? Because they'll get fucking murdered. So I find that really interesting that, that kind of triangle of what do? You just like, you get in with the system and do like a horrible but legal and respectable job without changing stuff. You try to change the system. And then, I mean, there's like officially all the kind of counts of like murdered activists I've found, and not just in Honduras, I think in Latin America for a variety of reasons that I'd like to investigate and I've thought about, are vast undercounts. Like there have been thousands
Mhm.
of people murdered for political reasons, since the coup and before that. Like I
Mhm.
really do think that, and I feel like anyone who has read even minimally or has heard about it, like actually knows that it's a huge number of people. And then so finally, just the fact that like this guy, and it's now a fascinating glimpse into the kind of world en México of, catrachos y otros que se han acabado en como estos mundos de abajo de criminalidad, ¿no? Pero es
Mhm.
que finalmente su forma de venderse un poco y sobrevivir y tener una vida un poco más estable es estar trabajando como un pollero, ¿no? Llevando gente
Mhm.
ilegalmente, bueno, nadie es ilegal, no me gusta eso, pero sobre la frontera de una forma
Mhm.
criminalizada. Entonces, y sabes lo interesante es que ahora también acaba de salir de esta guerra sucia, donde que
Mhm.
ahora, justo ahora, acaba de recrudecerse un poco más, ¿no? Esta semana han asesinado 3 personas por acá, neta. So yeah, right? But he, flees these kind of like savage, extractive, dirty wars in Honduras, right? And what he changes out for it is now he's in Sonora, where there's an even larger war resulting from US border policies and the drug war, right? Where now
Mhm.
paramilitary groups fight over criminalized migrant routes, right? But the sad thing, but the honest thing, and I feel like for me it's had a lot of insight, is that, oh, but his positionality in that conflict is much different because he's no longer trying to change the horribleness of the system. He's just existing in it as best as he can. So he is in less danger in Sonora, I think,
Mhm.
even though it's actually, I would argue, numerically more violent than here, right? Um, so, I mean, there's that. Sorry, I'm rambling way too much. Working on that project,
Mhm.
there's a project, there's like a, early on, like the stuff I was saying earlier about like the kind of securitarian views of violence and how it actually is
Mhm.
all deep seated classism. And it also gives failed, like, no, not failed state narratives, flawed
Mhm.
failed state narratives, right? That justify basically the return of military dictatorships, all that stuff. That's kind of based because I had like a pretty bad experience, which we could get into, but I don't think we need to right now.
Mhm.
In 2020, covering violence in San Pedro Sula for Vice News, and I felt deeply disappointed. I'm glad that I did it because it planted the right questions, but deeply disappointed
Mhm.
that I would have written a story like that. I mean, I was young, and you can't always,
Mhm.
redo like stuff in your youth, right? But I'd like to go back to the story of the kind of savage violence that we were dealing with there, but actually revisit that and tell the story of those people, and then try to kind of crack through the sort of securitarian lenses that keep us from understanding why this violence happens. So in terms of like Honduras, and then I'm doing continued coverage of like basically the dirty war in the Aguan, right? And like getting
Mhm.
deeper and deeper. And I really
Mhm.
love it out here, and I have so many connections and friends, and like also now like so many guys who've gotten killed. Like a guy who I knew for 5 years, Juan Lopez, was murdered 2 blocks that way. Um, 2 months ago, and so like it's also like the compromiso of like fuck. You see so many people just get mowed down. Like an entire generation of the social leaders of this town is getting
Mhm.
exterminated. Like, and I don't mean that to like be like hyperbolic. That's really what it is. Like, it's like 6 people that I've known, right? ever since
Mhm.
the dirty war started again, after coincidentally after the state of emergency started in 2022 in Honduras. Here it's been about 30 people killed in like this, small town
Wow.
context, right, where you're looking at, a pretty small area, and there's dozens of these kinds of conflicts that are unleashed. And yeah, so I'm just doing continued coverage of that, and one day, I'm not rushing to it right now, I'd like to do a longer project on that to kind of give dignity to those stories or whatever. So that's what I'm working on. But what
Yeah.
are you
Well,
working on?
I was gonna tell Brenda to talk, so she can go.
Wow. I'm just like, that's a lot. Yeah, but also, I think kind of ties into the project we're going to be working on as
Mhm.
filmmakers. That we're planning to have a documentary in Honduras that we're trying to shoot next year. And yeah, so we're trying to do a short documentary, specifically talking about how the lack of resources in the government, specifically towards public schools, and how basically you being in certain areas, the more rural, the less, that's being provided. And our goal is to be able to somehow tell their stories and also provide scholarships for these kids for them to continue their education. Again, there's people have a lot of commentary on like, oh, like, well, why don't they just go to work? It's fine, but I guess like what our mission is to provide longer education for them to at least get to their, what is it? Is it the le bachiller, where they get their like license for whatever specialty they are studying and be able to have a better future, not just, abide by, these rural areas where the kids just decide to start working at a very young age, or the girls get married off really young. So that's something we're hoping to do in 2016. I mean, 2026,
Yeah.
sorry.
2026, 2016. Um,
Ando mal.
no, it's all right. But yeah, but mainly like the documentary will focus on about the lack of resources that leads to child labor, you know. So around those stories and then this is why the
What that
podcast
leads
is
to
so.
child labor?
I'm sorry.
The what that leads to
Oh,
child labor?
like kind of like the lack of resources for education for kids that leads for child labor, you know, and not only for kids but also for families and like lack of employment or a story of a girl Brenda met that like had to be given to another family, and that kid needs to work before going to school, so like that's kind of like the documentary that Brenda is working on, and we're trying to do it also under um the podcasts because it's like what we have been doing for a while too, of like trying to support more educational resources.
That's cool because like I've never really actually investigated it, but like or gotten into it. And one day maybe. It's not on my horizon right now, but I feel like it's one of the, especially as a foreigner, coming here. It's so shocking and honestly just sad, when you see like,
Mhm.
especially in San Pedro Sula, like the thing that kills me the most is when you see like a 9-year-old doing the, wiping windows or whatever, right?
Hmm.
And I'm like, man, that sucks. Like, and you don't know how much it sucks, or maybe you do, and I don't know. But I
Hmm.
suspect that when you're that young, you don't yet realize how much it sucks. Because like when you're uh when you're that young, you should be like, doing this, like these kids, like being ridiculous and stupid and having fun, right? And it's
Hmm.
just like, so it really kind of kills me when you see that,
Right.
like they won't realize for years, if ever they realize, like, oh man, like that's, you really are being taken something really special from you. I don't know. What have your
Yeah.
like findings been so far in terms of like trying to research that or whatever, or, like your thoughts, or I don't know, what are your I'd be curious to hear more about your thoughts about that because I've
Yeah.
seen it so much and I've just never really like looked into it.
Okay, I was just gonna say, I mean, Brenda has been able to go to Honduras and knows family, and that's how she pitched the documentary. But to me, as someone who, okay, again, grew up in Honduras, I know that happens all the time, and and it's sad that is normalized. And as someone who, like, my mom worked to go to school, Brenda's dad worked to go to school, it's something that is so normalized in Honduras, right? But like it's to the point that, like you said, would they ever know that they have been stolen from their own childhood? And I think that something with Brenda and I said, like, every child should have a childhood, right? And it's like, what what is that like? So we haven't fully started doing our finding because Brenda's actually going to Honduras in February to start. So just to wrap it up,
Mhm.
it it would be like if you will, if you can share like where people can find you,
And
everything. Make sure I
also
have it. Uh-huh.
how we can support you because
Yeah. How can we
obviously
support you? Yes.
you're working independently and you're touching stories about our country and we would like to provide as much support as we can.
Mm-hmm.
No, I really appreciate that. It's funny. I feel like I've had to force myself, and it's actually been fun. It's like it's starting
Mhm.
off well the year. It's been things have been better professionally, but it's funny because I feel like I'm not like I just like writing and reporting, and then so doing the kind of like buccaneering self promotion I've never been as good at. And
Mhm.
so I mean, if people want to find my stuff, I can't believe I'm saying this. I never thought I'd say this, but I started a Substack, a newsletter where I send out because I don't want to just use Twitter
Mhm.
um, as like a kind of petri dish of neo-fascist bullshit to share, articles or whatever. Um, I need to think of a way. It's titled, and the title of it is the Convergence, right? I just launched it or whatever. But basically anytime I put out a feature, an investigation, or whatever, I'll send it out, or a series of interrelated articles, or a kind of stretch of coverage, but usually with an article tied to it. Send out a newsletter with a secondary kind of essay report or whatever, explaining these issues in a little bit more of an informal and hopefully accessible way. If you
Mhm.
want to support, you could become a paid subscriber to that, but it's not necessary because I'd want just people to read about this crap and care about it anyways. Um, yeah, so I mean, that's where you can, I guess, I don't know if you look up the name of the Substack. If you type in Jared, let me see. Hold
Do,
on, really
do,
quick.
do you have a
Actually,
link? I mean, because we're gonna link it. We can link it into the podcast so people can go. So if you can send us the link, we will link it into the description.
okay, yeah, I'll send you the link to that. I mean, you can like follow me on Twitter and Instagram, but
Yeah.
preferably Instagram over Twitter, and then just I don't know, sign up to the Substack. But just that, yeah, and yeah, and if you want to support, if you're able to, being a paid subscriber really helps because it's like ridiculously comical how you know freelancing is like scrapping around and like kind of like nothing all the time, which is it's fun, it's worthwhile because it's I like to think it's important and I really like doing it. So, um, anyways, I appreciate it.
No. No, but thank you for the work that you do. And like, again, I would say we will link your social medias, and then your Substack so people can go and support you there.
This is a dumb question, but salvavido or imperial?
Ah.
I think my dad likes Imperial more. I don't drink anymore, so
Okay, okay.
but
I
but what
don't
was it
know.
before though?
I don't know.
So I am not beer girl, but I would
Uh-huh.
say between two, because I have tried both. I would say salvavidas.
Salvavida,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah, yeah.
Actually, this is a last stupid anecdote, and I hope that if you actually need to go, please go. But
No,
it
no, no,
ties
no.
back to
You
this, and it also is just like funny, stupid Honduras stuff. It happened like three
Uh-huh.
days ago. I was driving to La Ceiba, and I was stopped and hung out with a source in La Ceiba, but
Mhm.
I got stopped. But this is a funny story. It's not going in a dark place or whatever. I got stopped and like petty extorted by a cop, Policía Nacional, like
Uh-huh.
stupid bullshit. It's
Yeah.
happened to me so many times. So I'm driving. I pass, like hour outside of La Ceiba, and these cops stop me. But now, like, I just turned 27, so like, and there's this weird like macho thing with guys where it's like they really respect age if they can tell. So like this kid who's like 21 or whatever, I know what he's doing, and he's like, I'm not that pissed off because I know how it works, right, or whatever. And this kid, he's like almost like acting out his like standard lines or whatever, where they're like getting visto from people or whatever. So then
Uh-huh.
I was like, pues ya sé cómo esto funciona. ¿Cuánto quieres? And he was like, bueno, estamos acá para servir y proteger. Pues sí, pero ¿cuánto quieres, güey? Because I'm not Mexican, right? And then it was funny because we ended up talking, and I was like, you know what? This is like my toll road shit. It sucks that they do this, but here's this fucking kid who, like, it's not great to. I'm not a fan of cops and the institution of policing, right? But he's just like a 20-year-old kid or whatever. And then so we ended up talking, and he could not like fully admit it, but I was like, es que, oye, güey, cuando estés tomando de esos chelas, ¿qué vas a tomar? And he was like, es que no, yo no voy a estar. Y I was like, sí, lo vas a hacer. Entonces, ¿qué vas a tomar? Y él was like, pues, salvavidas or whatever. And we were just talking about that. And I
Lol.
was like, you stupid motherfucker, but I hope you enjoy. I was like, espero que disfrutes eso. And I really meant it.
Yeah, no, my dad will always say every time you drive, vive en Honduras, era como siempre llévate un pisto extra para darle para las chelas.
Literally just for the beers for them. And it's just like, it's one of those things where you could get really pissed off about it. And there's been times where I have or whatever. And also, that's like a terrible institution and bad people in
Mhm.
it. But then there's just like, I don't know. He's just a like young Honduran guy, and they're still fun. And like, I'm just like, oh, this is silly and ridiculous or whatever. So hope you enjoy the salvavidas, man.
No, thank you for sharing that. Thank you.